following day, Rachel got her wish. The beach was now clean and dry again. Most of the blue bottles from the day before had begun to disappear. The wind was gone, and at last Rachel and her family placed their towels and picnic basket high up on the beach on the clean white sand. Her mother and father went for a swim, but Rachel instead lay down on her back on the towel to indulge herself in the sun's warmth. She reckoned after the last few days she would need some time to thaw out before she braved the ice-cold water. She lay with her eyes shut, examining the backs of her eyelids. The sunlight, today shining brightly, made her eyelids appear red and transparent. After a minute or so, her eyelids were becoming uncomfortably bright. She blinked them open. The sunlight made it hard for her to open her eyes fully, as its brightness was almost unbearable. She rubbed her eyes again and tried to open them. She slowly came to her senses and realized that she was no longer looking at the sun. Instead, the glowing, coloured lights with the circle of light at its centre was hovering just above her. She rose to her feet and was drawn into its centre. This time she was determined to find out more about it. She'd been this far before and had returned without harm, so she wasn't as apprehensive as she had been earlier on. She looked down to her feet, but they were no longer visible. She was again wearing the long, flowing white robe she had seen in her vision of the wounded soldiers. She took a step. She felt to be moving, and although she didn't fall, she could no longer feel the ground beneath her. A figure approached her from out of the light. He was the same young man she had seen helping the wounded soldier down from the armoured vehicle. He too was wearing the same white clothing as before, and as he smiled, his teeth and clothes glowed like neon. He held out his hand to her, and she placed her hand in his. It was warm, and she felt a peaceful, happy feeling wash over her. "My name is Zeb," he told her. "I am your brother." "What?" said Rachel. It was all too surreal. "This is your home," he went on. "You have many brothers and sisters here. We're all waiting for you, and we'll be here when you come home." Rachel shook her head. She couldn't understand. Home? Where was home? "We are all waiting for you," he said again. "But we know there's a job to be done first. Don't worry. We'll be here for you when you arrive." His voice was soft and steady, calming and positive. Rachel could have stood and listened to him all day long, but instead she forced herself to ask him, "Why?" "It is why you were sent here in the first place," came his reply. "When?" she asked. "Soon." She became aware that she was no longer on her towel. Instead, she looked down and realized that she was standing on the hot sand, and both her feet were burning. "There you are," came her mother's voice. "I was wondering where you'd got to. When we came back from our swim, you'd already gone. Don't worry, we've saved you some lunch." "Thanks," said Rachel. She sat back down on her towel, grateful at least that she was still dressed in her swimsuit. The rest of their stay passed relatively quickly, and all too soon it was the second last day of their holiday. They would be driving back tomorrow. Rachel's aim was to spend one last day on the beach, and if the morning was anything to go by, then the rest of the day was going to be a ripper. She grabbed her towel and book and made her way down the log-lined sand path to the beach. There were large areas fenced off with barbed wire to both sides of the track. Signs on the fence said, "Native Grass Regeneration Area, keep out." She finally made it to the beach and slipped off her thongs, feeling the warm sand once more. She found a nice place to lay her towel and settled down with her arms around her knees, gazing out to sea. She watched for what seemed to be a long time before picking up her book and starting to read. The gulls all around were making their usual ruckus, and the distant sounds of children laughing and playing came to her on the wind. She was absorbed in the book and didn't take much notice of what was going on around her. That was until she noticed that things had become unusually quiet. The sky seemed to darken slightly as if a cloud had passed over the sun. "That's strange," she thought, absent-mindedly. There wasn't a cloud in the sky earlier. She raised her head out of the book, intending to look up at the sky, but the vision before her eyes caused her to drop her book and leap to her feet. The beach was deserted. The birds were gone. So was the water. She walked a few steps out towards where the ocean had once been. The sand was wet. Out further, Rachel could see the flip-flopping shapes of fish that had been stranded by the rapidly receding water. Rachel looked to the sky at last. The sun was no more than a ring of fiery brightness, with a large black circle making up its centre. Rachel realised that she was witnessing an eclipse. As the sun started to creep out the other side of the moon, the light slowly began to return across the earth. It was like a brand new sunrise. Rachel again turned her attention to the seabed. And the noise. There was a noise like the wind, only it had a deeper, whooshing sound to it. She walked right down to the wet sand and cupped her hand above her eyes, trying to see out to the horizon. Now that the sun had returned, it seemed to be even brighter than it was earlier. The whooshing sound was growing louder, and a thin blue line with crystal-like tips had appeared on the horizon. The blue line grew thicker by the second, as the noise turned into a roar. The ocean was returning to the beach. It was returning at a rate of knots in the form of a giant tsunami, over 100 foot high. It was obvious it was not going to stop when it reached its former coastline. It was going to continue inland, consuming everything in its way, somehow seeking retribution for being held back in such an unnatural position, and definitely set to overcompensate. Rachel was unable to breathe, terrified. She couldn't move her legs, not that it would have helped her anyway if she could. At last the giant wave reached her, and the deafening, thunderous wall of water went straight through her. She fell flat on her back as the ice-cold water slammed over her. "Rachel, Rachel, are you okay, honey? Wake up!" Her mum and dad had come down to the beach looking for her. They found her lying flat on her back in the sand, barely breathing. Someone had called an ambulance and they were giving her oxygen when her parents arrived. She'd been unconscious for the best part of 20 minutes, and she was sent in the ambulance to hospital to be checked over. She kept coughing up salt water and it was making her sick. The doctor insisted that she must have got caught in a rip and nearly drowned, but all the bystanders had told the same story. She'd staggered down the beach staring at the ocean, before she'd fallen backwards heavily and gone unconscious. She wasn't even on the wet part of the sand at that time. Everyone was baffled. After a few hours of observation, she was allowed to return with her parents back to the holiday unit. No one was sure what to say about the incident, so they all decided, much to Rachel's relief, to say nothing. On the way back home the next day, the conversation finally led to the events of the previous day. The parents were insisting that Rachel go for a checkup with their local doctor as soon as they got home. Her mother was sure that Rachel had allowed herself to become run down during a month spent away at university. Rachel admitted, much to her mother's distress, that she indeed had had an attack. She proceeded to describe the details of the giant tidal wave in her vision. Her father then suggested that she probably had dreamt this while she was unconscious. That explanation suited her mother and allowed her to feel comfortable again. No matter how much Rachel tried to insist that it occurred the other way around, their minds were made up. Rachel gave up. She decided not to share any more details of the visions from the past few months, in case her parents thought she had gone totally mad. It was unnecessary and futile to tell them. They didn't understand her gift. Instead, she spent most of the return trip with her eyes closed, pretending to doze. Her parents had insisted that she needed to rest, so if they thought she was asleep, it would save her from any further awkward conversation. She thought about her meeting with Zeb. That circle of light was her home? He was her brother? Well, at least now she understood why they'd never been able to find her parents, and just what was the job Rachel had to do. It was all part of the same intriguing mystery, but if the visions were anything to go by, she would be finding the answers very soon.